Welcome, class. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 11, the endocrine system. Hormones are the main regulators of metabolism, growth and development, reproduction, and many other body activities. These come from our endocrine system. They play important roles in maintaining homeostasis, fluid and electrolyte balance, acid-base balance, energy balances. Hormones make the difference between health and many conditions such as dwarfism, gigantism, and sterility. They are important not only for healthy survival of each one of us, but also for the survival of the human species. Learning objectives for this chapter are to distinguish between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Define the terms hormone, hypersecretion, and hyposecretion. Identify and locate the primary endocrine glands and describe the principal function of the major hormones produced by each gland. Describe the mechanisms of non-steroid and steroid hormone action. Explain how negative and positive feedback mechanisms regulate the secretion of endocrine hormones. Define and explain the importance of prostaglandins. Describe the conditions that may result from hyposecretion or hypersecretion of endocrine hormones, including insulin, growth hormone, antidiuretic hormone, thyroid hormones, glucocorticoids. So, essential points about the endocrine system. The endocrine system performs the same general functions as the nervous system. Remember, we call it the neuroendocrine system because it's involved in communication and control of bodily functions. The endocrine system produces hormones. Hormones are the primary regulators of metabolism, growth and development, reproduction, and many other body activities. Hormones are essential in maintaining homeostasis, such as fluid and electrolyte balance, acid-base balance, and energy balance. So all organs of the endocrine system are glands, but not all glands are organs of the endocrine system. There are two types of glands in the body. We have exocrine glands that secrete their products into ducts, and then we have endocrine glands. The only endocrine glands belong to the endocrine system. They secrete chemicals known as hormones into intercellular spaces, and each hormone molecule then binds to a cell that has specific receptors for that hormone, triggering a reaction in the cell. The cell is known as the target cell. Endocrine glands secrete chemicals or hormones into the blood. Hormones perform general functions of communication and control, but a slower, long-lasting type of control than that provided by nerve impulses. Production of too much hormone by a diseased gland is called hypersecretion. Hyper is too much. Hypersecretion. If too little hormone is produced, the condition is called hyposecretion. Now, there are two major classes of hormones. We have non-steroid hormones and steroid hormones. So this here will show the endocrine glands. So if you'll notice, we have our hypothalamus. You can see the pituitary gland, the pineal gland. You see the thyroid, and on either side of the thyroid, you have the parathyroids. You see the thymus down on the mediastinum. You see the adrenal glands over the kidneys, the pancreas or the pancreatic islets, ovaries in females, and then testes in males. So let's talk about non-steroid hormones. These are the first messengers. They bind to receptors on the target cell membrane, triggering second messengers to affect the cell's activities. Non-steroid hormones are whole proteins, which are shorter chains of amino acids, or versions of a single amino acid. So anytime you see amino acid, think protein. Now, non-steroid hormones typically work according to the second messenger mechanism. Okay, so they're the first messengers, they're released. Non-steroid hormones are released, they bind to receptors, they activate the second messenger mechanism. So this shows the mechanism of non-steroid action. This is where the protein hormone, that first messenger, goes into the cell membrane through the receptor. Now I want you to notice something here. There's something called a G protein here. G protein, GTP, that is only in non-steroid hormone action. So remember that. You can see the enzymes. It will activate the second messenger system when it's picked up that activates other enzymes and starts a process within the body or the cell. Now, steroid hormones are a little different. Primary effects of steroid hormones are produced by binding to receptors within the target cell nucleus, not on the membrane, and influence cell activity by acting on the actual DNA. It is a slower process than non-steroid action. The secondary effects of steroid hormones may occur when the steroid hormones bind to membrane receptors to rapidly trigger functional changes in the target cell. Steroid hormones pass through the cytoplasm and enter the nucleus, binding with a receptor. So if it's a lock and key model, right? A specific key fits in a certain lock. So certain steroid hormones fit in a certain lock. And without that, they cannot penetrate the cell membrane like non-steroid hormones can. This complex acts on DNA, which ultimately causes the formation of a new protein in the cytoplasm that then produces specific effects in a target cell. This is a form of protein synthesis, so synthesizing, breaking down like protein, or building up protein, building up protein synthesis. So here's the mechanism of steroid hormone action. You can see where the steroid hormone that's in the blood vessel goes into a target cell, goes into the DNA, but it has a lock and key. So if the receptor's not there for that specific hormone, it will not unlock and go into the DNA, make changes, and form a new protein to cause a reaction. So hormone secretion is controlled by homeostatic feedback. We either have negative feedback. These are mechanisms that reverse the direction of a change in a physiologic system. We've already talked about negative feedback, such as like with temperature, maintaining the constant temperature within our body. And then we have positive feedback. These are uncommon mechanisms that amplify physiologic changes rather than reversing them. And examples of positive feedback is like contractions during childbirth and blood clotting. So in the endocrine system, we have another example of negative feedback, and this is in response to insulin. So in this example, an increase in blood glucose or blood sugar triggers the secretion of insulin. Because insulin promotes glucose uptake by the cells, the blood glucose level is restored to its lower normal level. Unless you have diabetes in which there's too much glucose and either not enough insulin or impaired insulin. So you can see where we eat, it absorbs the glucose in the intestines after a meal. The glucose goes into the blood, increases the blood glucose level. The pancreas responds by secreting insulin. Then the insulin starts to meet with the glucose, and eat it up in the bloodstream. Goes into the insulin, causes liver, skeletal muscle, and other tissues to take up more glucose, so they store it, and the stored glucose in the liver is called glycogen, and homeostasis is then restored, and we have a normal glucose level. This is how it should work in a negative feedback of blood glucose and insulin. Now, prostaglandins, PGs, are powerful substances found in a wide variety of body tissues. They play an essential role in communication and controlling many bodily functions, but they do not meet the definition of a typical hormone. So we call these atypical. Often, prostaglandins are produced in a tissue and diffuses only a short distance to act on cells in that tissue. Therefore, we use the term tissue hormone. PGs, leukotrienes, and thromboxane are sometimes called paracrine agents, and that is important to remember. There are several classes of prostaglandins, including prostaglandin A, or PGA, prostaglandin E, or PGE, and prostaglandin F, PGF. Prostaglandins influence many body functions, including respiration, blood pressure, gastrointestinal secretions, and reproduction. Now let's talk about the pituitary gland. The structure of the pituitary gland. We have two glands of the pituitary. We have anterior and posterior. The anterior pituitary gland is known as the adenohypophysis. Anterior adenohypophysis pituitary gland. Posterior pituitary gland is known as the neurohypophysis. Very important. So this image here shows in green hormones that are secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. Those are in green. And then you see in the bluish lavender those that are secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. So in the anterior pituitary gland, we have growth hormone, which affects the bones. We have adrenocorticotropic, ACTH hormone, affects the adrenal cortex. We have thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, that comes from the anterior pituitary to the thyroid gland. We have gonadotropic hormones, which is FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. These affect the testis and the ovary. And we got prolactin, which affects the mammary glands. Now, from the posterior pituitary, we have the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, which affects the kidney tubules. And we have oxytocin, which affects the uterus smooth muscle and mammary glands. And you must know which hormone is associated with which area of the pituitary, either anterior or posterior. So anterior pituitary glands. So let's talk about these three. First, we have thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. It is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and it stimulates growth of the thyroid gland, and it also stimulates it to secrete thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are T3, T4, and thyroxine. And so TSH helps to stimulate thyroid hormones. Then we have our adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, that stimulates growth of the adrenal cortex and stimulates it to secrete glucocorticoids, which mainly is cortisol. So glucocorticoid, cortisol. Then we have follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. This initiates the growth of ovarian follicles each month in the ovary and stimulates one or more follicles to develop to the stage of maturity and ovulation. FSH also stimulates estrogen secretion by developing follicles, and it stimulates sperm production in the male. Other anterior pituitary gland, or another one, is luteinizing hormone, LH. This acts with follicle stimulating hormone to stimulate estrogen secretion and follicle growth to maturity, causes ovulation, causes luteinization of the ruptured follicle, and stimulates progesterone that is secreted by the corpus luteum, which you should remember. Causes interstitial cells in the testes to secrete testosterone in men. Now, the final anterior pituitary gland hormones are growth hormone, which stimulates growth by accelerating protein anabolism, or the breaking apart of protein, accelerates fat catabolism, and slows glucose catabolism. By slowing glucose catabolism, it tends to increase blood glucose to higher than normal level, or hyperglycemia. Now, prolactin stimulates breast development during pregnancy and secretion of milk after the delivery of the baby. Now let's go into posterior pituitary gland hormones. The first one, which is extremely important, is the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, which you must know. ADH accelerates water reabsorption from urine in the kidney tubules into the blood. Thereby, it decreases urine secretion, so we don't urinate out everything that's all the water in our body. Hyposecretion, or too little of ADH, results in a condition called diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus is a condition in which large volumes of urine are formed and urinated out. So you're losing more water than you're putting in. Now, oxytocin stimulates the pregnant uterus to contract. It may initiate labor. It causes glandular cells of the breast to release milk into ducts. Remember, prolactin makes the milk. Oxytocin releases it. And it enhances social bonding with the newborn and mom. Now, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus also produces releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. The combined nervous and endocrine functions of the hypothalamus allow the nervous system to influence many endocrine functions. The actual production of antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin gets stimulated from the pituitary, but it actually occurs in the hypothalamus. After the production in the hypothalamus, hormones pass along axons into the pituitary gland. The secretion and release of posterior pituitary hormones is controlled by nervous stimulation. The hypothalamus controls many body functions related to homeostasis, such as temperature, appetite, and thirst. All come from the hypothalamus. So let's talk specifically about the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland lies in the neck just below the larynx. Thyroid stimulating hormone gets released from the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland, goes down in the blood, and the thyroid will pick up the TSH. Then it stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroxine T4, triiodithyroxine T3, and it accelerates catabolism, so it increases the body's metabolic rate. That's why if you have a thyroid, like if you have hypothyroid and you don't produce enough thyroid hormones, you actually end up with a slower metabolic rate, and it can cause weight gain. Now let's talk about calcitonin, because calcitonin is so important. Calcitonin decreases the blood calcium concentration by inhibiting the breakdown of bone. So it stops the breakdown of bone, which would release calcium into the blood. Vital to know that. So here you can see where the thyroid and the parathyroid glands are located. Now, the parathyroid glands are small lumps of glandular epithelium. There's 2 on each side of the thyroid. The parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone. This increases blood calcium concentration by increasing the breakdown of bone with the release of calcium into the blood. So it does the exact opposite of what calcitonin does. These work together. The parathyroid works with the thyroid to keep the calcium level balanced in the blood. So this gives you an idea of the regulation of blood calcium levels. So it's a feedback loop, negative feedback loop here. So we have high blood calcium. That will stimulate, because there's too much calcium in the blood, it'll stimulate calcitonin from the thyroid. That'll increase. That breaks down the bone matrix, so it breaks down bone, and calcium levels in the blood will then decrease to make a normal blood calcium level. Now, if the calcium level is too low in the blood, the parathyroid hormone secretion increases and it breaks down the bone, which will increase the amount of calcium in the blood, and it will rise to the normal blood calcium level. Moving on to the adrenal glands. These are located on the superior surface of each kidney. An adrenal gland is actually two separate endocrine glands, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Now, the adrenal cortex is the outer region and it is glandular. The adrenal medulla is the inner region and it is secretory nervous tissue, so it secretes. So here you can see the adrenal gland lying on top of the kidney. And of the adrenal gland, you have the outer layer, which is the capsule, the inner, which is the cortex layer, and then the inside of this actual adrenal gland is the medulla. So you have the capsule, you have the outer zone, the middle zone is the cortex, the inner zone is the medulla. Zones of the adrenal cortex. So why is this important? Well, the adrenal cortex is extremely important because of corticoids. These are hormones secreted by 3 cell layers, or the zones of the adrenal cortex. The outer zone secretes mineralocorticoids, which is chiefly aldosterone. So outer zone of the adrenal cortex, aldosterone. Middle zone of the adrenal cortex is glucocorticoids, which is cortisol or hydrocortisone. Now, the innermost, deepest zone secretes sex hormones. Small amounts of male hormones or androgens are secreted by the adrenal cortex of both sexes here. Zones of the adrenal cortex continued. So let's talk a little bit more about aldosterone. Aldosterone is the chief mineralocorticoid. You must know that. Mineralocorticoids increase blood sodium and decrease body potassium concentrations by accelerating kidney tubule reabsorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium. So we hold on to more salt and we pee out more potassium. Now, in the adrenal cortex, the cortisol, this is the chief glucocorticoid. The function of glucocorticoids are to help maintain normal blood glucose concentration by increasing what's called gluconeogenesis. This is the formation of new glucose from amino acids produced by the breakdown of proteins, mainly those in muscle tissue cells. Also, the conversion to glucose of fatty acids produced by the breakdown of fats that are stored in adipose tissue cells. Cortisol plays an essential role in maintaining normal blood pressure. I cannot stress that enough. It makes it possible for epinephrine and norepinephrine to maintain a normal degree of vasoconstriction, which is a condition necessary for maintaining normal blood pressure. Other functions of glucocorticoids, they act with epinephrine and norepinephrine to produce an anti-inflammatory effect, to bring about normal recovery from inflammations of various kinds. They also produce anti-immunity and anti-allergy effects. They bring about a decrease in the number of lymphocytes, which are white blood cells, and plasma cells, and therefore a reduction in the amount of antibodies formed. Secretion of glucocorticoids quickly increases when the body is thrown into a condition of stress. So stress will actually increase cortisol. High blood concentration of glucocorticoids in turn brings about many other stress responses. So stress response. So say we have a high blood glucocorticoid or cortisol. Over time, it will increase mobilization of fats and tissue proteins. It increases liver gluconeogenesis for mobilized fats and proteins. It decreases the breakdown of glucose but increases fat. And it tends to produce hyperglycemia. So too much cortisol or hydrocortisone, hyperglycemia. And this is important to remember because we're going to talk about prednisone and other steroids or corticoids, glucocorticoids in the future. And one side effect of prednisone and steroids is hyperglycemia. Another thing that could happen is it could cause even more atrophy of the thymus. Well, the thymus is important in immune function and allergic responses. So then you have decreased immunity and decreased allergy response. And then another effect of high glucose could be inhibited inflammatory response, which means that you could end up with accelerated recovery from inflammation. Now let's go into the adrenal medulla. This secretes hormones, epinephrine, epi, or adrenaline, and norepinephrine, known as norepi or NR. The functions of these hormones help the body resist stress by intensifying and prolonging the effects of sympathetic stimulation or sympathetic nervous system response. Increased epinephrine secretion is the first endocrine response to stress. So stress, you get too overwhelmed with stress and epi gets released. When stimulated, it squirts epi and norepinephrine into the blood and produces the body's fight or flight response to danger or stress. Moving on to the pancreas. We call it the pancreatic islets, also known as the islets of Langerhans. So islets of Langerhans, pancreatic islets or insulin, basically is where it's produced, is at the islets of Langerhans. If the pancreatic islets secrete too little insulin, you'll have type 1 diabetes. You will have to have insulin shots to bring down your blood sugar, because less glucose leaves the blood to enter the cells, dramatically increasing how much glucose is in the actual blood just floating around. And I want you to think of it this way. If there's too much glucose, that means there's too much sugar in the blood, and germs love sugar. So it makes you prone to infections and inflammation. Most cases of type 2 diabetes result from a decrease in insulin and an abnormality of the insulin receptor. So you still produce insulin in type 2 diabetes. You just have abnormal receptors. It's not working as well. Now, glucagon is secreted by alpha cells in the pancreas. This increases the blood glucose level by accelerating liver glycogenolysis, or the conversion of glycogen in the liver to glucose. Because remember, when glucose is stored in the liver, we call it glycogen, and glucagon gets released to break down the glycogen to put it back into glucose. Insulin is secreted by the beta cells. Decreases the blood glucose by accelerating the movement of glucose out of the blood and into the cells, which increases glucose metabolism, provides energy for the cells. So this shows the pancreas. You can see the common bile duct where the pancreatic duct is, and you can see this little square cutout here. You can see all of the pancreatic ducts, the beta cells, the alpha cells. So the alpha cells secrete glucagon in the pancreatic islets. The beta cells secrete insulin in the pancreatic islet. Then you have the pancreatic duct that goes to the duodenum, which we're going to talk about in the digestion chapter. And that's where we get our pancreatic enzymes that help break down some of our different molecules. Now let's talk about female sex glands. The ovaries contain two structures that secrete hormones: the ovarian follicles, which secrete estrogen, and the corpus luteum, which secretes progesterone mostly. So corpus luteum secretes mainly progesterone, just a tiny bit of estrogen, but mainly progesterone. Now, the effects of estrogen. So estrogen is known as the feminizing hormone. That's what makes us look more feminine. The development and maturation of breast and external genitals. Estrogen also causes the development of the adult female body contours and the initiation of the menstrual cycle. Now, male sex glands, the interstitial cells of the testes, secrete the male hormone testosterone. Very important. Now, the effects of testosterone is what's called masculizing hormone, more masculine features. So this will mature the external genitals, cause beard growth, voice changes at puberty, development of musculature, body contours typical of the male, chest hair, things like that. Now comes the thymus. The thymus is located in the mediastinum. In infants, the thymus may extend up into the neck as far as the lower edge of the thyroid, but it shrinks as we age, so we typically think of the thymus as being in the mediastinum. It is a very small structure, weighs less than a gram, and the thymus produces thymosin. Thymosin plays an important role in the development and function of the body's immune system in the regulating and maturation and function of T cells, T lymphocytes. So thymus, think T cells. Thymosin and T cells. Now the placenta acts as an endocrine gland when pregnant. It produces chorionic gonadotropins, estrogen, and progesterone, and it functions basically to maintain the corpus luteum during pregnancy, to maintain progesterone and not a ton of estrogen during pregnancy. The pineal gland is a small gland near the roof of the third ventricle of the brain. It's kind of back behind the nose. It is a glandular tissue that predominates in children and young adults. It becomes fibrous and calcified with age. The pineal gland is called the third eye because its influence on secretory activity is related to the amount of light entering the eyes. And the pineal gland secretes melatonin, which inhibits or stops ovarian activity and regulates the body's internal clock and sleep cycle. So the endocrine functions are throughout the body. There are many organs, such as the stomach, intestines, and kidney, that produce endocrine hormones. The stomach lining produces ghrelin, which affects appetite metabolism. The atrial wall of the heart secretes ANH, atrial natriuretic hormone, which stimulates sodium loss from the kidneys. And we have fat storing cells which secrete leptin. Leptin is the fat hormone, which controls how full or hungry one feels. So let's move on to endocrine hormone disorders. So gigantism is a disorder that is caused by the hypersecretion of growth hormone during early years of life. Think Andre the Giant. Diabetes insipidus is hyposecretion of antidiuretic hormone. Because remember, antidiuretic hormone helps us to reabsorb water and salt, not pee out as much. So in diabetes insipidus, there's copious and copious amounts of urine being produced. A goiter happens in the thyroid, and it produces a lump or a tumor, and it happens because of a low dietary intake of iodine. Cretinism is hyposecretion of thyroid hormones during the formative years. So as a young little child, you can develop cretinism, which we talk about in further nursing program. Diabetes mellitus type 1 is caused by pancreatic islets secreting too little insulin. And type 2 is a decrease in insulin and an abnormality of the insulin receptors. Glycosuria is excess glucose that is filtered out of the blood and lost in the urine. We should not urinate out glucose. If glucose is in the urine, that means there's too much in the blood. And that ends the lecture on the endocrine system. Make sure that you're paying attention to everything that I talked about and that you attend the Q&A session. Thank you, and you will hear from me in the next one.